Hi, this is Tyson, and you're watching JavaScript Vignettes. Today we're looking at an introduction to React, and we're kind of walking through the lifecycle methods on your stateful components. And by stateful components, I mean any class-based components. They don't necessarily have to contain state, but they have to be a class extending React.component or a pure component. And so we are going to go ahead and look at the lifecycle methods in React and how you can use them for your advantage and for your app. So first of all, whenever you create a new React component, it's going to call the constructor right away. And the constructor, basically, this is where you can set the state for the initial state for your component. It's where you can bind methods to the actual class object, which is kind of a limitation of JavaScript classes right now. And so to get around that, you can do all the binding inside of your constructor. Component will mount is called as soon as your component is being mounted, when it's being rendered from another component. This is only called once per mount, and it's a good place to get a lot of things set up. Then you get your render method called, and then finally component did mount is called, which basically says, all right, the component's already been rendered, so now you can go ahead and do some additional stuff. So let's go ahead and look at this basic little pin here. And I have my console open. So you can see, first of all, the constructor is called. And so I'm logging it right here. And then component will mount is called. So there I'm logging that. And then component did mount is called after render. So first render and then component did mount. So the way you can use these, basically, the constructor, I mean, you're going to want to use this for binding things. So like, for example, if you have a method called say hi, if you called it from here, if you had like a click handler or something here, so if I had like a touchable opacity, which I already imported, so I have a touchable opacity, and so I have an onPress event, and on the onPress I'm going to say this dot say hi, and when I call that, I want to set my state to for the greeting to be hi instead of hello world. So I'm going to say this dot set state greeting hi. So what happens right now when you click on this is it's not going to be setting the state. It's actually, if I had my, here, I'll open my real console. So you see here that it's saying this dot set state is not a function, and the reason for that is that the context is off. And so what we need to do is actually change what the context of this is whenever we call this dot say hi. So one way you can do that is right here in the render method itself. You could bind it to this, and then when you click it, it says hi. But that's not really ideal, because what bind does on a function is it creates a new function. So that means that every time you re-render this, you're actually creating a new this.sayHi function. And so that can be resource intensive, and so that's not really the best way to do it. The better way to do it is here in the constructor. I could say this.sayHi equals this.sayHi.bind this. So now I've created a new function that's always bound to the this of the component class, but but it's also only bound one time instead of being rebound every single time you render the function. So now I click it and it says hi, which is exactly what I wanted. Okay, so that was the constructor. Next of all, let's look at component will mount. So component will mount. This is called like whenever the component is beginning to mount, but it hasn't actually rendered yet. So this could be a good time if you're doing something with fetching data or analytics or something like that. Like you can kick that off early before the component even mounts. Like usually I would do something asynchronous here because you don't want to have to wait around for something to happen. So it's a good idea to just kick something off and let it take itself from there. And then finally, after the render, which I mean we've already looked at the render quite a bit, so I'm not going to go back over that. But after the render, component did mount is called, and component did mount is a little bit different than component will mount because it's fired after render, which means that the component's already been rendered, and on the web you have the DOM which you're using, so that means that you can actually like modify the DOM and do different DOM manipulation. For example, if you had a jQuery plugin that you wanted to put in here, you could do that, or if really anything you wanted to do that requires the component to already have been rendered. And you'll probably not need to do things like that a ton, but it's good to have because there are instances like if you wanted to initialize a WYSIWYG editor like CKEdit or something like that, this is where you would do that. And so you could also fetch your data in component did mount if you would prefer to wait for it to render first. So that's really up to you. All right. So back to the methods. So when you actually update something, when you do something like set state or a prop changes, something like that, first you're going to get the component will receive props, and this basically just notifies you what the next props are going to be before anything is changed, before the component even updates, and before we even know for sure that it will update, because we can actually cancel that in a should component update. And should component update basically gives you the previous state and the previous props, and you can compare that to what your current state and current props are. So you could use this as a performance optimization and say, okay, actually, if you return true, then it'll go ahead and update the component. But if you return false, for some reason you might figure out that this particular component doesn't need to update, and you return false, then the component will not update, and so that can save a lot of rendering time. And then after that, the component will update is called, and that's a good place to basically know that the component's about to update and prepare the state for that. I rarely use this because I tend to want to go ahead and let the component render and then do component did update, where I know the component already did render, and then I can do additional stuff after that. So here we have another example of it. This is the order it happens in. So first, component will receive props is called, and then component should component update. So I'm just doing a quick comparison. I'm saying if the new props.greeting is not equal to this.props.greeting, then it'll return true, and then if it is, then it'll return false. So only if these are different will actually go ahead and update. And then component will update is called, and finally component did update is called. And so you see here we're actually changing the props. So this is the app component, which is using this greeting component. And so inside the app, I have this initial state where I have like my greeting, and then after the component mounts, I set the state to see you later. And so because that changes, it's going to re-render this greeting because it's taking this state, which I've spread over the greeting, and and so now it's going to say, oh, this has changed, and so it's going to compare the previous greeting and the new greeting, and it's going to say, all right, well, something's changed here, so that'll return true, and it will go ahead and update and re-render this view. So that's basically the life cycle of an update. Last of all, whenever you're about to leave a component, if you're unmounting it for some reason, like if you navigate away from it, you're using some kind of router, or if it's something that responds to a click and disappears or is removed or whatever, component will unmount is called. And component will unmount basically is a place where you need to clean up your events, if you have any like DOM manipulation that needs to be cleaned up, if you have any event listeners or timers that are hanging out, this is where you need to clean them up so you don't run into a lot of issues as people keep clicking around your app, and it's basically a good place to make sure that you've done all your cleanup. So the basic rule of components is that they should always clean up after themselves. So here we have our component will unmount because we have this .state.show greeting, which starts out being true in the app component, and then after the component mounts, we set it to false, so it goes to null instead of using this rendered component. And so when it becomes null, it unmounts, so it calls component will unmount. So at this point, like if we had, for example, if we had event listeners, so let's say we had inside of component it did mount, we had an event listener like we have a resize event listener. So a resize can be pretty resource intensive if you're changing the size of your window not a lot. So we could call this on resize. So we'll need that method. So on resize, and remember, like you're not going to have the right context for this in the on resize. So inside of your constructor, you're probably going to need to do something like this. Of course, calling the super. So you're going to want to say this dot on resize equals this dot on resize dot bind this. So that way you'll have the correct context inside of on resize, because you don't want to do dot bind this, especially here, because then the reference to this function is going to be different than whenever you remove the event listener right here. So here we're going to remove event listener, and so this will be the same method that we already had. So we're just removing the on resize event listener, and so basically just cleaning up after ourselves, because we had an event we were listening for, and now we don't need to listen for it anymore, and it would actually be problematic if on resize was called at this point, because we could be doing some kind of crazy manipulation or changing the state, and you don't want to change the state for a component that doesn't exist anymore, because you'll actually get some warnings about that. So yeah, that's essentially that is the lifecycle methods in React. And in our next video, we're going to be looking at something called higher order functions or higher order components, where you can basically compose your stateless components with your stateful components, and put them together, and do it in a loosely coupled way.